Welcome to another deep dive. You know, I think we all just assume that the Bible we read is, well, just the Bible. But this article dives into the differences between two really important texts, the Septuagint and the Masoretic text.
Yeah, that's a great point. Most people probably aren't even aware that there's a difference or that they could be reading a translation based on one or the other.
Right, exactly. So to start, can you give us like just a super quick, explanation of what these two texts actually are?
Of course. So the Septuagint, that's an ancient Greek translation of the Old Testament, and it was created way back around 300 BC.
Wow, 300 BC.
Yeah. And it's believed to have been commissioned, by King Ptolemy II.
Oh, wow, for the Library of Alexandria.
Exactly, for the Library of Alexandria.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Now, the Masoretic text is, well, it's a Hebrew version of the Old Testament, but it was compiled a lot later, around the 7th century AD.
Okay, so that's like, what, almost 1,000 years later?
Yeah, you're talking about a huge gap. And it was compiled by Jewish scholars. We call them the Masoretes.
And so, that's a significant difference, right? Almost 1,000 years. And that's part of why I think this article argues for the Septuagint being superior.
Right, and it's not a perspective you hear that often.
Especially like in Protestant circles.
Yeah, especially in those circles. And what's interesting about the article is that the author, he actually started out with a pretty standard, Protestant view.
It tells us that too.
He preferred the King James Version, thought, different translations, whatever, but something really changed his mind.
It was that Proverbs verse, right?
Yes. He came across this totally different translation of Proverbs 11.3.
In the Orthodox Study Bible.
Yeah, the Orthodox Study Bible compared to, his King James, a Catholic Bible he was looking at, and even the Tanakh.
Which is, just to remind our listeners, is the Jewish translation based on the Masoretic text. And, some of these differences, they're not just like small differences.
Oh, absolutely not. Like, for example, the OSB translates Proverbs 11.3 as, when a righteous man dies, he leaves regret, but the destruction of the ungodly is immediate and brings joy.
Wow.
Right?
Wow.
Compare that to the King James, which says, the integrity of the upright shall guide them, but the perverseness of transgressors shall destroy them.
It's like, it's hard to even connect those two as being the same verse.
Yeah, it's really wild.
It's like a completely different message almost.
Yeah, and that's what really sent him, the author, on this whole journey. It's fascinating, the religious and cultural influences that, shape how the Bible's been translated and understood.
So Protestants often prefer the Masoretic text because, well, it's in Hebrew, right?
Right. It's in what they consider the original language.
The language of the Old Testament.
Yeah, and the author actually points out this irony.
Well, I love this point.
They, emphasize this original Hebrew, but then criticize the Catholic Church. But here's the thing. The Catholic Church today, they base their translations on the Masoretic text.
Because of that 1943?
Yeah, that papal decree from 1943.
Wow, so it's actually the Orthodox Church that uses the Septuagint.
Exactly. They've held on to it all these years.
Okay, so we've got our two players, but I want to hear about the Septuagint's origin story. The article mentioned something about that.
Oh, yeah. The story of the 72 elders.
Okay, what's that?
Well, it goes that King Ptolemy II, he commissioned 72 Hebrew elders, super wise guys,
Right.
to create this Greek translation for his library.
Okay.
But get this. Each one worked totally alone in separate rooms, and when they were done, their translations were, identical.
Wait, what?
Yeah, it was seen as a miracle.
That's incredible. What's the significance of that?
Well, it shows how people viewed the Septuagint, it was divinely inspired, the idea that 72 guys come up with the exact same translation, independently.
Yeah, it's pretty wild.
It had to be God, right?
Makes you think.
And that's important because, the Septuagint was probably what Jesus and the apostles used.
Oh, really?
Yeah, Judea at that time was really Hellenized, Greek culture was everywhere.
Oh, right. Greek was like the common language.
Exactly. It was the language of, everything. Trade, communication, you name it. It was all over the Roman Empire.
So even though Jesus grew up in, Nazareth, he probably would have been more familiar with the Greek.
Absolutely. Way more familiar with the Septuagint than the Hebrew.
Okay, that makes sense.
And this is where it gets interesting because the Pharisees, they were known for being really strict.
Right.
And they completely rejected the Septuagint.
And they didn't like Hellenized Jews either. Right?
No, they didn't. They saw Hebrew as the only true language of faith.
It's like they wanted to keep things, pure or something.
Exactly. It was all about preserving tradition. The author makes this interesting comparison to the Catholic Church later on.
Oh, yeah. insisting on Latin.
Yeah, Latin as the language of worship, very similar.
So it's all about maintaining tradition, or maybe even a sense of exclusivity.
Yeah, maybe. And the author makes a really interesting connection to Jesus here.
Okay.
He thinks Jesus might have used the Septuagint on purpose
Oh, interesting.
as a way to connect with those who were excluded, like the Hellenized Jews that the Pharisees rejected.
That's fascinating.
Yeah, like the choice of which text to use wasn't just about preference, it was a statement.
It makes you think about the implications of, which text we're reading.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So if that's the case, why do so many of our modern translations rely on the Masoretic text, which came centuries later?
That is a really good question. It's kind of crazy to think about. The Masoretic text, the one so many translations are based on, it wasn't put together until, way after the Septuagint, after Jesus.
Yeah, centuries later. And the author makes a big deal about that because it raises the question of bias.
Wait, bias in the text itself.
Yeah. I mean, think about it. The Masoretic text, it was compiled by Jewish scholars, the Masoretes.
Right, around the 7th century AD.
Exactly. And that was, long after the split between Judaism and Christianity.
When things were not so friendly between the two.
Yeah, definitely a lot of tension. So the author is asking, could the Masoretic text have been, maybe changed a little to downplay parts that could support Christian ideas?
That's a pretty serious accusation.
He's not saying it was intentionally malicious or that the Masoretes weren't good scholars.
Right.
But he wants us to consider the possibility that, their viewpoint, their context, it might have influenced the text.
Okay, I can see that. Does he give any examples of this?
Oh, yeah, and one of the big ones is Isaiah 7.1 scene. You know the one about the virgin birth?
Behold, a virgin shall conceive and bear a son.
That's how it's usually translated in Christian Bibles based on the Septuagint. But in the Tanakh, which is based on the Masoretic text, it says, look, the young woman is with child and about to give birth to a son.
Hold on. Young woman, not virgin. That's a huge difference.
Exactly. And for the author, it's not just a word change, it's a shift in the whole meaning. Like they're trying to downplay the messianic interpretation.
So they're saying that maybe, just maybe, they changed it because they didn't want it to support the Christian idea of Jesus' birth.
Right. And he gives other examples too, and it all starts to make you wonder, how much of our understanding of the Bible is shaped by things we're not even aware of.
That's kind of unsettling to think that there might be these biases.
It can be, but the author isn't trying to make people doubt the Bible. It's more about encouraging us to, really dig in, to compare different translations and to think critically about what we're reading.
So not just taking things at face value, but trying to understand where they came from.
Exactly. And one of the key takeaways for him is that when there are differences between the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, we should pay more attention to the Septuagint.
Seriously. But wouldn't the Masoretic text, being in the original Hebrew, make it more accurate?
It seems that way, right? But the author argues that the Septuagint gives us a glimpse of how the Hebrew scriptures were understood before the whole Judaism-Christianity split.
So like a pre-Christian understanding.
Yeah, it's a tradition that both Jews and Christians shared before they went their separate ways.
And that's important because...
Well, for the author, it shows the connection between the Old and New Testaments. Like, the Septuagint reflects a Hebrew faith that was already pointing to Jesus.
Wow, so he's saying that the idea of Christianity was already there in the Hebrew scriptures, but we need the Septuagint to see it.
That's a big part of his argument, that it's a more authentic representation of the Hebrew faith that Jesus himself would know.
It makes you wonder how differently we might understand certain passages, or even the whole Bible, if we look at it through that lens.
Yeah, it's definitely a shift in perspective. And he goes on to talk about how the Septuagint has been preserved really carefully by the church throughout history.
But hasn't there been disagreement even within the church about, translations and interpretations?
Sure, every group has its own debates. But his point is that the church, as the body of Christ, they've had a reason to keep the scriptures as close as possible to how the apostles and early Christians understood them.
So he's saying that the church's tradition is like a protection against changes or biases that might have happened in other translations.
That's a good way to put it. He sees the church as, the guardian of the scriptures, and he thinks the Septuagint is the most accurate version of that message.
It's making me think about how these two texts, the Septuagint and the Masoretic text, they might represent totally different ways of looking at faith.
Yeah, the author gets into that, translating the Septuagint into Greek, that made it available to way more people.
Right.
But the Masoretic text, sticking with Hebrew, it's almost like a more I don't know, inward-facing view.
So it's like one is this open, universal kind of faith, and the other one is more about tradition and maybe a little exclusive.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to see it. And it makes you think about how Judaism and Christianity relate to each other.
And the author even says that Christians shouldn't be using a post-Christian source, the Masoretic text, for their understanding of the Hebrew Scriptures.
Yeah, that's a pretty strong statement.
Yeah.
But it's
Yeah.
important to remember he's not saying the Masoretic text is worthless.
Right, or that it's like deliberately wrong.
Exactly. He acknowledges the scholarship. He just wants us to be aware of the context, the potential for a certain viewpoint to be baked in.
So we need to be critical, not just accept it without thinking.
Exactly. And that critical approach is what leads him to say, hey, the Septuagint is a better guide, especially for Christians.
Okay, so are you saying we should all throw out our Bibles and go find a Septuagint?
He doesn't go that far. It's not about telling people what to read.
Okay.
It's more about making us aware of all the different ways the Bible has been interpreted and translated.
So like opening our eyes to the bigger picture.
Yeah. The Bible we have today, it's the result of choices made over centuries, interpretations, translations, all that stuff has shaped how we see it.
Wow, this whole deep dive has really made me think. I never really considered all that goes into the Bible we read.
Right, we just kind of take it for granted.
Yeah. And it's amazing to think about all this scholarship and debate that's behind it.
And that's what's so cool about these deep dives. It makes us dig a little deeper, to engage with the text and not just passively accept it.
Where would you suggest someone start if they want to learn more about this, about the Septuagint and all that?
There's tons of great stuff out there. I mean, some people have spent their whole lives studying this. Just searching online for Septuagint versus Masoretic text. That'll give you a good starting point.
It really does feel like we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, absolutely. And I hope all our listeners will, keep digging, keep learning, and see what they find.
Oh, thank you so much for walking us through this. It's been really eye-opening, a whole new way to look at the Bible and its history.
It was my pleasure. Always happy to geek out about this stuff with people who are interested.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of Bible translations. We hope you learned something new and that it'll inspire you to keep exploring.
Keep those questions coming, folks, and we'll see you next time.
Until then, happy reading.